This is a special edition conversation as we will be running video imagery of the guest during our conversation. I'm honored tonight to be talking with photographer, artist, and researcher Dannie De Fazio. How did I do with my Italian, or actually I should say my Roman accent, Danny?
Perfect. Fantastic.
Fantastico. Danny has worked around the world as a photographer. In addition to being a National Geographic and Canon Photography Award recipient, he has worked from India to Los Angeles, Africa to Germany, and Japan to London. And he has spent the last 7 years in Japan, mainly Kyoto, where he has been researching and photographing Kiyomai dance and Kagai culture. His work with Inoue Yachiro V of Kiyomai dance resulted in her first ever performances inside the UK during sold-out exhibitions in Edinburgh and London. It's really an honor to have you, Danny, and thank you for taking some time to talk about your journey through photography, and we're looking forward to spending a lot of time on your work in Kyoto. So thank you for making time for us.
Thank you for inviting me to the channel.
Well, I know that you have been a wanderer for most of your life and probably has had the camera with you most of your life. But before we get into your work in Kyoto, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, the origin of how you came into photography and how that journey started.
Actually, I started as a hobby. My father bought me a 35 millimeter camera. I still remember with two lenses, 35 millimeter and zoom lens. It turned out in the long run that it became a passion of mine. But unfortunately, in the case of my family, it was that artists and photographers or any kind, let's say, of art was perceived as something that didn't have future. I had some kind of struggle. My background was I learned to become a pilot. My dad was a diplomat, and I supposed to follow my family footsteps. So when I decided to apply to work in Alitalia, but I didn't pass on the fifth or sixth selection, I cannot remember right now. That's what I realized, that I was doing that only because probably, I was young and I was attracted about the lifestyle and uniform, but really didn't have a passion to do that. And that's when I decided to give up everything and, concentrate in photography. But unfortunately, my family disagreed to the idea.
It's really interesting that it was a gift from your father, so in some sense did contribute to your lifelong passion, even though if it was in kind of opposition to accepted standards. It's very interesting. And I know that probably as a diplomat family, you've grown up all over the world. But when I went to Rome, I was 19, and I noticed something very interesting about the city. There's not many cities in the world that I think teach people to be photographers, because I noticed that even the tourists were not taking the standard tourist photos. And when I was there, it kind of, you notice these, I remember being on Palatine Hill with the Augustus house, and all of a sudden taking this picture of the long images with the long hallway with sun coming through the windows, so to speak, the carved windows, I guess you'd call them. And then there were cobwebs. And then you would see cobwebs on ancient statues in the corner. And so it seemed to be a place that teaches you to see like a photographer in a way that not many cities do. A lot of the other cities, you want to take photos of you in front of a tourist site, let's say. Now, I know you had a lot of experience before, but did those early times when it was a hobby, did certain cities, whether it was Rome or certain locations you lived with your dad, start to shape your photographic eye, how you saw?
Absolutely. One thing, for example, I realized through time was the use of light. And I know this can sound like cliche from a photography point of view, but I always meaning in terms like I could appreciate more the sunset, the sunrises, and, the nighttime. That's something I still remember very vivid. And it happened mainly because in the beginning doing photography, I make some mistake. We need to remember at the time was a film, 35 millimeter film, not digital.
Right.
So you wait until, they get developed and print to see what is the outcome. So I took photographs and I didn't realize how good they were in terms of lighting, like a warm light from the sun hitting, a building or people. That's what pushed me also more to learn about photography, because I was doing good mistakes, also bad mistakes. Although it was as a hobby, I was very passionate to read and learn about photography. And one thing I want to really mention before also we move on is also that with regard with my family and my dad, what happened is that then I think probably after 10 or 15 years, because he saw the how I evolved with photography and what I was doing, kind of he changed his mind
Wow.
and he was proud about what I was doing.
Well, that's amazing. And I know that when you move to places that you've lived there long enough to not only learn the language, but also to kind of learn to see or learn to be in the place. So I don't know how many languages you know now, about 7, 8. It's hard to keep track. But I think it's very interesting that when you went to Brazil, let's say, as an example, you didn't spend just a few months there and move on. You spent time there. Same thing with Los Angeles. Ultimately, when we get to the deeper discussion about Japan, but it was the same with Germany when you live there. And, they do say that you don't understand a culture till you know the language. But I do also think that that's true regarding time spent in the culture with the people and seeing even city cultures that are very specific. I mean, now I'm here 7 years in Izmir and I see things differently than when I got here. So if I would have left after 2 years, I wouldn't have seen the city or understood it in the same way without spending the time here. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about these places you live. Well, I guess, A, do you agree with that statement I just made? And also, if you could talk, if you do, a little bit about, I guess, what you gained, how your eye and understanding was affected by these places you live. I'm thinking mostly I think it was Rio de Janeiro and Los Angeles, for example.
One thing, I mean, about language, I mean, I honestly I never was good to learn a language. The reason I probably I speak several languages is also because I live in different countries, as you pointed out, for a long period of time. But one thing that is very true is how you feel the language, I will say, or how you feel a word that you use in a language. And I think, some people they can perhaps, master a language, but they will still missing the sense or the feeling of the culture. So yeah, you need to spend the time kind of open your eyes about further than what the dictionary say. Visually, I will say that the thing that probably teach me the more was countries like, as you mentioned, Brazil and Kenya. I lived also for a long period of time in Kenya, where the culture have a big contrast to European culture. But then at the same time, the other place I would say that it changed a lot, Los Angeles, was very interesting because it was also was a combination of things. It was a combination of the culture because you have Hollywood and you have all these people with such a high energy that they want to become actors, very outgoing, and that is something that is very rare to see. The other thing that I was very surprised is the multicultural. You can say people from all around the world living there, or even perhaps they're American, but with different ethnic backgrounds, and again very outgoing. So to shoot, it was very interesting because people they were camera friendly, and then they had the period where there was transition from film to digital, and that was a very very interesting period of time because I remember even many photographers saying, digital camera never going to work. Film always have a better quality. And now it's all digital. We don't have film. And it's interesting too because how it changed also the traveling culture because it's so cheap and easy to take photograph. You can take even with a phone. In the past, you need to buy films, you need to have enough film, and on top of that, you never knew, of course you knew if you know how to take picture, but still, you wanted to see the result, what it means, process and print, and sometimes, for example, I did a mistake in the dark room, so I lose pictures like that, so until you didn't have the end results, it was impossible to see the outcome. Where again, where this is all instant, instant you can see what you took picture. Oh, I mistake, I do it again.
Yes,
it's like a Polaroid.
Well, it's really interesting when you mention LA, and especially at that time where you saw the birth of digital, because one of the giants in American photography, of course, is Ansel Adams, and he has multiple photographs where he talks about going. I think there's one of his famous ones in Yosemite, when he goes and he sits in a chair with with his camera set up, and he just waits and he watches the light for hours and hours. And then he takes a couple of photographs and he's done and walks away. And there's another famous photo of, you may have seen it, I think it's called Moon in New Mexico, or Moon over New Mexico, where it's a small town with the moon over it. And I think he took one exposure.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have this really just super attention to detail. And then, of course, he had a lot of innovation in the darkroom that became part of his art. So there is this one polarity with represented by Ansel Adams as the perfect photographic artist in a way. And then the other polarity where you can take thousands of photos on your phone.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And they both, so you can't, I think, and let me ask you this, do you think you can be successful without combining those two in some way? You have to have some of the Anselm Adams and some of just the taking thousands of photos.
Yeah, I think nowadays more than ever, you're saying exactly the right thing, more than ever. This is no critique, but it's a fact, because technology, everybody we can take pictures, and very fast, and sometimes quite good because of technology, but a good photographer is always about the knowledge of photography, the knowledge about, framing and eye details, and also, to be patient for the right moment to take a picture. So composition, lighting, all this kind together of knowledge combined with technology, you can create amazing things, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And before we get to Japan, I wanted to also bring up kind of a cursed name in American photographic history, but it's Edward Curtis, who photographed the Native Americans, the Indians, quote unquote, because he was often giving them props that they didn't have. And he did all these portraits and they were wildly successful. But now from our post-colonial perspective, we see how he symbolizes such a non-understanding, such an appropriation of the subject in a negative way, that it's an important value for photographers to learn. So I'm curious about when you lived in these places and were photographing, regardless if people were camera shy or not, how did you learn, or did you accumulate some skills in relating to people and connecting with the place that allowed you, when you did eventually go to Japan and you embarked on these really complex projects, did you build these skills to kind of not appropriate from a culture or not objectify a culture, but had learned how to connect with in a way that was much different than, unfortunately, the sad example by Edward Curtis?
I need to be honest, and I think this is something that everybody go through, and then it's up to each person how they develop their self. In the case if they are photographers or even tourists, for that matter, with no technology, how they develop their self as a person who want to learn about cultures or receive something in photograph or video. So the first stage is that, and I did that, and I don't mind to say, is that because I believe that, culture enter first of all from the aesthetics. So when you see something, that is different, attractive, that's why I mentioned when we were talking just minutes ago, Kenya, or I should mention also India, although I didn't live there, but I visited several times. So you, unfortunately, you make that mistake because you get so excited that you want to capture that excitement, what you've seen. So I still remember when I went in Kenya for the first time out, and I saw some of the indigenous people because the color they were dancing, and I remember going crazy. But I think that there is always a process. So in my case, I was lucky and I was very young at the time, so to stay there for about 3 years. So what happened, I have learned probably, let's say like that, by accident, what you just mentioned. So my first action was to get excited. Yeah, the same thing going in safari. And when I say safari, it's not to hunt animal, but literally to take photographs safari. So you get excited without thinking about consequences of what you're really doing. I don't know, it's kind of very interesting psychologically. It's like you want to capture that excitement. By capturing the photograph, you think you have as a property, let's say that now it's yours. But then it's what you said, then you realize if you stay for a long time that you don't learn nothing about the language. So in my case, for example, in Kenya was a very good example because I was very young. So then I used to go every other month to visit the Maasai tribe. And I remember even the tribe people inviting me inside this hut and even offer me food. Even without having a common language, you start to develop some kind of a relationship with the people and you start to learn things. There are some schools of anthropology that believe in the use of video and photography, and that if you live a long period of time in a place, than then you know about the culture. I, to be honest, I still believe it. Even I was in Kyoto, and we will talk, in a minute about these things. Still, I don't believe I learned enough to be an expert on another culture. So perhaps the only way you can learn is by really embracing the culture, living there, follow their traditions, and giving up yours. But yet, at the same time, you improve your knowledge. But I still, even as a photographer, still struggle to say, even I'm talking about my photography, that my photography reveal or say something about the culture. I still don't believe that. I think it's a combination of things. The combination of the photograph, the combination of meeting people, the local people, learning about the history of the place. It's a combination of things. I think it's a very, very complex matter, to be honest.
Yeah, I like the word you used, ultimately forming a relationship, not only with the people who may be subjects, which of course comes into your time in Kyoto, but also a relationship with the language, a relationship with the aesthetic and historical tradition of the place. And you never kind of lose where you came from, it seems, in talking to you, but you enter a relationship of trust, if not complete union, but trust with a local area that produces the subject or is the subject of your work. Yes.
I think the best thing how to put it is the camera. In the end, is like a mirror. And that's the way I perceive it. So the reason what I do when you mentioned in the introduction research is more about a learning that I can pass to other people. Because again, the camera is like a mirror. So what I learn in reality is something that I perceive, or what I frame in a picture is me really. Is what I perceive. And the relation that you build is what I had a chance to learn. So I give you an example. I was, for example, in Israel, and I met a Holocaust survivor. And talking to him, first of all, I approached because I wanted to take a picture. It was in Haifa, in the city of Haifa. And I didn't know that he was a Holocaust survivor. But it was an old man, and I like his face, the wrinkles of his face. So I thought it was perfect for a black and white picture. But instead to say no, he invited me to sit down next to him.
Wow.
And the thing that was surprisingly, I still remember this experience because I remembered he didn't have any hatred. He didn't have any regret. He was so peaceful man. And and I was thinking with his experience, probably, if it will be me, I will be angry or I will complain about life. And then at the end of the conversation, he smiled. He said, "Well, now if you want to take a picture, go ahead."
Wow. So it's almost like I love the word you used about, it was kind of like learning instead of taking. And that's what you're talking about in this conversation. You could learn about him and his story, and then you could not take his photo, but then you could kind of move that dimension of that conversation or of that interaction into the photographic realm.
Right, exactly. And I know it sounds very selfish, but the energy that drive me to do, for example, research through photographing like that is because what I learned, rather than what I can, offer.
Right.
And again, I think it's very selfish. I can understand that, but that's the reality. It's probably because my background, that since little I was traveling. I went always, for example, to international schools. That's what they attract me. They attract me the contrast, and the contrast is where I found that you can learn and you can have different perspective, or you can also learn different point of view of history, for example. Yeah. That's very important.
Yeah, and it's that it's kind of ironic that you would call it selfishness, but when you do approach and you are a stranger in the place, but you embrace learning about the place, embrace learning and become a listener of stories, whether it's histories personally or their perspective on history, you're trusted in a way that's the complete opposite of how a tourist shows up and kind of is him or herself. But the person who goes in and embraces the language and the place and wants to learn, wants to hear stories, that trust is essential for a photographer to build, it sounds like.
I know we're going to talk in a minute, but one of the places I learned the most was in the Kagai, what is the geisha, where the geisha live, in Kyoto. And the funny thing was that because when I went there, came like a a big shot. Yeah, I have this, to remember, letter of recommendation from the Japanese ambassador. So I'm going to their main office, and so I come inside the office, introduce myself. I give a business card, and then I give this letter of recommendation. Yeah, and they look at me. They look at the letter like for 5 seconds, and they give it back, and they say, "Sorry, we cannot help you."
Yeah. So what? What else you got? Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
then I start to go every morning in the street, wait for the geisha going to train, dance. Then in the evening time when they're going to work. Then the second step was to greet them. They, of course, many of them, they wouldn't greet me back because they were, who is this crazy foreigner here standing? Then I will learn their names because in the annual dance program, they have the photograph with their name. So then I start to greet it with their name. So they start to change. They start to get surprised how this guy know my name. It's more complex, of course. I had also then I started to meet some people who helped me too at the same time. But they were some of the geikos, what is the term for geisha in Kyoto, who they're helping me to get inside and start to do my research work.
Yeah, and you're learning the language and day in and day out, and it always fascinates me all of the unspoken of work and time that goes into one image. You see this in wildlife photography. If it's in the Arctic, of way in the Arctic, you think about all the time it took to find that one image, and we often, I think, overlook that with images involving people. They think it comes faster, it comes easier, but there's so much work, and we're going to get into that right now. Let's get you over to Japan. But I have to ask you, I've seen your photograph that has been sold in galleries, including in LA, of the Holy Man in India. Incredible photograph. So I'm curious if there was briefly a story about that interaction that led to that photograph.
It was a similar situation as what happened in Haifa in Israel. With the gentleman who survived the Holocaust. The difference was that he was sitting there, he wouldn't talk, he was sitting in the street. He would literally don't talk to me. So then I decided to sit. First, I sit next to him, he wouldn't talk, and then I will make signs, if I can take a photograph, and he wouldn't say anything. So I spent probably, I'm not exaggerating, but probably 5 hours, things like that, staying with him until the same thing, then he agreed to take a picture of him.
Wow. Well, let's get you to Japan. And when I went to Tokyo, unfortunately, I haven't been there more than once. And there was a couple images that stuck out for me as the contrast that exists in modern Japan, I think exemplified in Tokyo, but is present throughout the country. When I first went to Shinjuku Station and looked at the subway map, it was one of the most complicated subway maps I've ever seen. And I'm from New York, and I've taken the subway all over the metro in Paris and London and St. Petersburg, Russia, and New York, and this subway map was so complicated, Danny. Even if it was in English, I don't think I would have understood it. I stared at it, and Shinjuku Station, which has 1 million passengers a day, I don't think I ever came out of that station the same entrance twice. I never kind of knew where I was when I got off of the line, and I would just end up somewhere. And then I was staying in a house that had I did my laundry in the dryer, the washer, a small washer in the house, as you know they have in Japan. And then when it was done, I asked my host, I said, "Oh, I need to hang these up." And she said, "Well, what are you talking about? They're dry." And it was one of the combination units where it's one machine, but it washes and then dries. And I felt like a barbarian, because I had never seen one. Usually there's in America, you have the washer and the dryer, or like in Turkey here, I have the washer and then I hang dry. And she looked at me like I was a barbarian. And everything was high tech all over Tokyo, of course. But then I asked her to take me to a ramen place. And we found this ramen place that was highly rated by locals in Tokyo, because she was from Tokyo. Well, she wasn't from Tokyo, but she lived in Tokyo. She was from actually outside Hiroshima. But she took me to this ramen place that was God knows where in Tokyo. I could never find it now, and only had 4 tables. Nobody was there that was anywhere near a tourist. There was just another couple of locals there, local Japanese Tokyo residents. And we started talking to the owner, and his ramen recipe went back decades, if not a century. And they would spend days on the sauce. And so it struck me that you have these two powerful impulses of kind of a surface technology, fast changing pace, but this other strand that is kind of surviving through the centuries of change. And I think that's what you probably encountered. I'm wondering if you encountered that same situation when you went to Kyoto, because I know there's cultural aspects that go back centuries that are still going on and still practiced, even while in another strand or on the surface, there's a lot of fast-paced, technologically changed fashion, media, all this stuff. So it was very striking when I went to Tokyo to encounter that.
Actually, that's is you experience a bit that, but especially I think I will say so that's in Tokyo. In Kyoto you also encounter other type of contradiction, I will call culture contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
But the best explanation is that is the background history of the country. So until the late 1800s, like Japan was a secluded country. So they have only trade with the Dutch, China, and Korea. They receive a lot of news from China, for example, from the Opium Wars and things like that. That's why we are resilient to accept Western power coming to the country. But then, unfortunately, the allies, especially the United States was the first one, they break in. And the reason why they did it is because Japan didn't have the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. So to make it very quick, because otherwise we need to have a completely different conversation, the Japanese government decided to sacrifice a bit the traditional culture to buy time. And that time they would utilize it to catch up with the West, to make themselves strong, and then pull out the Western powers. In result, nowadays, that's what you have, is a culture contradictions. There is a very good say, unfortunately, I cannot remember the name of the Japanese philosopher who say, they say Japan is like nowadays cherry blossoms. Because in Japan, nowadays cherry blossoms, they're hybrid. They are not natural cherry blossom. During the transformation, they cut off the cherry tree and they use it for fire. And then they start to create scientifically these hybrid trees. So he compared nowadays Japanese culture with nowadays cherry blossom. It's a mix of the science and the traditional Japan.
Right. Wow, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
That guy's very wise. That's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. Well, this is a good segue into your work with Kagai Culture. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can start learning about that specific Kyoto tradition that is being still practiced and your work with that.
They have what they call in Go Kagai, what means 5. Let's call in Geisha Town for the audience that don't know the terminology in Kyoto. Again, geishas in Kyoto, they call in geiko. And they have what they call in apprentice geisha or geiko, what is maiko. So Kyoto, as a culture city, they have preserved almost the original structure of the Kagai or geisha town in whole Japan, where, for example, in Tokyo, there are some modifications. They have the apprentice geisha, they do now 2 years. They start at 18 years old, where in Kyoto, they start as 15 years old. They need to do 5 years to become a geiko. So it's tough. In some areas like Kanazawa, they don't have apprentice geisha. They become geisha at once. And each area that has adapted depending of the economical and social system that has changed from the feudal time in the 1800s to nowadays, let's call democracy, capitalism, and now globalization. But in Kyoto, they're still resistant. They're trying to keep as much as they can the original system. So to give an example, one of the reasons why no one can become easily a customer in a tea house is that, first of all, they don't take credit cards. You don't pay per visit. They send you a bill at the end of the month. It's a relation of trust. To become a customer, you need to be introduced from a customer. Let's say I introduce you and luckily you become a customer. If let's say 1 month you don't pay the bills, I'm responsible because I introduce you. So that have to do with Japan culture or Kyoto culture 1800s.
Wow. And as you started to gain the acceptance or the trust or be accepted into the community, were there common stories about why certain people chose this path, or were they very different? What were some of the stories as you learned about the people working in Kagai?
They facilitate to them a very high standard of life. I interviewed one gecko. She told me, I don't mind and I like to have a boyfriend. But as far the respect, I'm not going to get married. Because one of the conditions to stay as a gecko is to don't marry. You need to be single. They can have even children, but they cannot get married. So as far as they can accept that, she said, I don't mind. Now, to be honest, the majority nowadays, they feel that they want to get married at some point. So meaning that they know that their career is going to end.
And what does the West consistently miss, whether in the form of a tourist visiting Kyoto for a couple of days and walking through this area and taking quick photographs, or people even just encountering the word geisha in California in an article? I remember working in a bookstore years ago, and it was very popular. I think Arthur Golden wrote the book. Right, it was a very famous book. Was it Diary of a Geisha? Geisha?
Memoir of a Geisha.
Memoir of a Geisha, yeah. And there seems to be simultaneously this wanting to learn more and really embrace understanding. But on the other hand, there's also this dismissive aspect of it's just, I don't know, associated with a brothel or a red light district or something. Very minimizing, very dismissive attitude. So what do people listening who've never been or have never read it, what do they need to know about it right away to understand that this is a unique tradition and a unique place? How do you describe it when you're talking to people about your work outside of Kyoto so they can get it?
Well, I think that is the concept of art and the concept of performance art. If you look at Japan, even when they have the ukiyo-e, they didn't consider it was art. They became art because Western collectors, with the Dutch sporting, they used to literally to wrap the teapot with ukiyo-e. And the European, they will open and they will go crazy. This is art. And they will start to sell it. So but the same happened. It's very interesting. They happen the same thing with the performance art. So Western tendency is either, like you just said, to think that is, a red light district, or is the other extreme where, because the name, geisha means person of art, they connected, so the performing art. But in reality, in Japan, service and entertainment, they interlock. And that's what the tea houses and the geisha, they do. The other thing is that is the very, very old tradition. The reason why it's exclusive is because it's expensive, because it requires trust. But most importantly, if you become a customer, the business is run within the concept of learning the customer. And for that, you need time. So a very good example, one of the Okasan, one of the owners of the tea house, is calling Ichiriki, one of the most famous tea houses in Kyoto. She explained me, we are not interested for people to come, for example, with a credit card, because we want to learn about the person, to please the person, to give the maximum of service. So they study what they like to talk, what their preferences of jokes, they make him laugh, what this person doesn't like to talk. They learn everything in detail. So they have customers that they go in there for 5 years, 10 years, for a long time. So the gecko role is that. Is first of all to share in intimate time. The second one of the most important is to keep privacy to everything that is talked. Probably one of the things that I really admire is this concept of trust that they have. Where literally, if you could imagine now you are a customer and you go into a place that you feel that you are at home because whatever you do is going to end there and is safe. I think that the main challenge, especially as a photographer, and that what I discovered myself was that, as I said at the beginning, that the thing that attracts the most to access a culture is the aesthetics. And that's unfortunately, and I say unfortunately in the whole sense of the word, is what the geisha town has. They have such a high standard of aesthetics, from the makeup, kimono, so much detail and uniqueness that, especially for a photographer, it makes it so difficult to learn about the culture. And that's what actually happened to me. I mean, I was lucky that I spent 6 years, 7 years there. But in my first 2-3 years, I thought that I knew everything. I was so cocky, so strong, and suddenly hit me one day that I didn't know anything. And I know this is not connected because, be careful, Inoue Achille Fifth, she's not a geiko. She's a master dance from the school of Kyomai Inoue Ryu. But she's the master who teach the dance there. But the thing that hit me was because even I spoke to her once in my early years. One of the first things I wanted to do it was an event in London and then in Edinburgh. And I remember talking to her, and she was so nice to say, well, if you want to get geckos there to dance, it's going to be very difficult. I know that you like them because they are younger, and I feel bad because I thought that she was trying to tell me something, and I couldn't understand it. Just being honest. So we left it there. She never agreed to do this event, and so typically, probably Kyoto language is very gray. It's based on their past history, especially during the samurai and shogun time power that used to switch so rapidly that the local people, their language, they need to show no preference in no one. Otherwise, they will lose power, especially the merchants. So they will be so, neutral in their language. Wow. So when power changed, they were no enemies of the new, leader, let's call it like that.
They spoke very carefully to not end up on the wrong side because of a certain conversation.
Exactly. So the same thing happened with her. Of course, stupid me, I thought, well, maybe she's going to change her mind. But as I start to learn more and more, now today I realized that at that time she said no, but I didn't feel that she said no. She said no, it's not going to happen,
And just to be clear, this is how you began working with the master Inoue Yachihiro. Yes, that's who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So then it happened that the same year they have this celebration in what they call in Kaburencho, which is the theater, Gyonko Kaburencho. And I'm going there, and it's beautiful because the first dance is her, and it's full of geiko, maiko, and I swear to God, and I mean, she's dressing, I still remember this brown kimono with a bit gold inside, and when I say no makeup, I mean, this white makeup like the geiko they wear, no katsura, which means the wig of that the geiko they use. But I swear to God, her dance was so hypnotic that I completely forgot about my surroundings. I was literally concentrating her dance. Like everything around disappeared. Until she didn't finish and everybody started to clap, I didn't realize. And that's when it hit me. And that's what I mean about the aesthetics is probably the worst enemy for photographers in the geisha town. If you can break the aesthetic, which is, the mask, the makeup, the kimonos, everything, that they're so beautiful, then you start to get the sense of the Kagai culture, what it really means. In the case of the geiko, I have, the luck to interview them, to talk with them. Actually, very sweet experience. I follow one Maiko that she became a geiko. They have what they call in erikae, and she see I'm writing thing. And then I asked permission if I can use her name. They're giving a name when they become Maikos, and then they keep using as a geiko. And she said yes, but then in a very sweet voice, she asked me, "What are you going to write?" I said, no, it's just about this and that. And I didn't realize she was worried. And then finally, she got courage to ask me. She said, "You're not going to write something bad about me." I think, the best thing I can resume that is that they are like any person like us, look for happiness, improve things in their life. So I think that they deserve also the respect. And unfortunately, nowadays, especially with the digital technology, people, as I say in the beginning, everybody want to be part of that, especially with the selfish. And later, when they come the time that they start to work, they go into the tea houses, it turned into a safari.
Right.
See all these tourists waiting around the city, the town and the street. As soon as one comes, they all rush, the whole crowd rush and trying to stop them to take picture. And one of the misunderstandings is that, tourists, they think they can take picture, and then some tourists, they get upset. They say, "Oh, they're so unfriendly," but they don't understand. If you are a customer and you hire a geiko or a maiko, you pay from the time that they step out of the place of living. So it's like a taxi. The meters don't count. So out of respect of the customer, that's why they walk in and don't stop. Because if they stop, means that the customer is paying for that photograph.
Right. It seems like, talking to you, that one of the huge things that the majority of the world overlooks is the aesthetic aspect that we're learning about it from you, but also the amount of time it takes to go from Maiko to Geiko, the amount of study, the amount of practice of mastering, I would imagine, tea ceremony, instruments, makeup. Those things are never really talked about when we encounter it in the West. We overlook both of those things, it seems to me.
Yeah, and this is and that is one thing, and then there's also the concept what we were talking in the beginning of transient life and concept of photography in Japan. So in Japan, photography came during the Meiji Restoration. The way how they call things, let's say a camera, it was called rueikyo, means literally a mirror that stops shadows.
Wow.
And then shadow and portrait in Japanese is kage at the same time. Now, if you talk about photography, it's satsue, and satsue literally means taking a shadow, and photography satsue kai, a person who takes shadows. So the whole vocabulary about photography evolved about shadows. What is the concept again of transient? And again, the thing that we don't understand, and this is probably the best explanation coming back to what you say about what I can say about the geckos, is that a gecko, when become 40 years old, it's her decision whether to wear makeup and the typical kimono and the katsura, the wig, or not. And the majority of them, they don't. But guess what? They're still as popular as the geckos that wear the makeup, and they still have their regular customers. Nothing changed. And the reason being is because their experience. So in the end, the customer also they realize what is important is the experience. So for example, I've been invited, and so to go out with in a tea house with a Maiko, my experience is, of course, as a Westerner, was wonderful the first time. But then the second, the third time, I started to realize, okay, with the Maiko, the thing I can have more than more is fun, it's more childish fun. But with the Geiko, you can have sometimes interesting conversations. It's a completely different level. And at some point, the makeup, all this outside aesthetic, what I call it a mask, it doesn't matter that much either. If you go in deeper, I think that the more you're in contact, probably the more you realize that. So I think that the worst enemy, unfortunately, again, I would say is aesthetics and against time.
And the last thread, and this is a good conclusion, um, because we wandered through this conversation wonderfully. But I want to go back to when you said the master, Inoue Yachiro, she had told you no, but ultimately you ended up working together. So how did it come about?
Well,
You ended
again,
up organizing the exhibitions in London and Edinburgh, and so how did that no become a yes?
well, because again, it come back to the very, very beginning when I say I went to the Cow Range office, the theater office, with a letter of recommendation. It's all
Right.
about trust.
Yeah.
It's she saw me then for a year. She saw me what I was intending to do in my work, and so I developed. I will say, I mean, I don't want to be arrogant in this respect, but I will assume that I developed some level of trust, and that's what brought to for her to embark to this in the project. But yes, it's very interesting because the first year was all excuses, and then in the last 2 years I brought it up again,
Hmm.
and then it was different. Then she sit down, we talk with her daughter too. So I think that, again, because she saw the trajectory, not only that, I give you another example. In the beginning, the door of her house was closed to me,
Mm-hmm.
but then there's a lot of ceremonies in her house with the geisha too. And then she started to invite me. She started to let me go in. She let me also to make some video, to take photographs. And the same happened, of course, with the geiko, with the geisha town in general. So yeah, it's what the Okasan from Ichiriki, what they calling the owner of the tea house called Ichiriki, told me they need time. They need time to learn the person. So time is the solution of everything. Again, it's all connection with shadows, with transient,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Trust.
with trust. Yeah,
Yeah.
but trust is connected with time.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's interesting how that goes back to the holy man in India. Of course, it took a lot more than 5 hours sitting next to him. It took years to build these relationships, but it's still the same lesson. And I'm curious about how, if you could say a little bit about what dances were performed in the exhibitions in London and Edinburgh, and I know they were sold out, but how was some of the reactions if they had never been able to see this performer before, this master?
But there was one of the main challenges was, to explain people the Kiyomai no Ryu. In the West we know about no kabuki. We have a general knowledge about that. You know that. But the Kiyomai no Ryu you don't know about. And it's part of one of the 5 traditional performance art recognized by the Japanese government. Like in Italy is opera. So I started more with that idea then. The other thing was that, the Gionkobu, and I will explain probably another time if we have chance. The Mia Kodori was the first all-female performance accepted officially by the Japanese government. So, and then on top of that, you have that the master of the Kiyomai school, it comes through blood, through generation, and the same family. And that's something we don't have in Western culture. So to explain that to people, we did a documentary that was projected before the performance. And then we have 2 performances. So the master performed last one of the traditional dance from the Kiyomai school of dance, and her daughter performed, with the white makeup, the wig, to show also the audience the contrast of that. So one of the main reasons to explain what a mai is not dance, it's a mai. Dance in Japanese is odori. So in a dance narrate a story, where mai allow the audience the feel reading a poem. That is the main difference. And to be honest, it was well received. One of the reasons I say that is because we have questionnaires after theater with paper, but then we have also email addresses of people that they got the ticket. And so we email, and we Skype, and we talk with them. I mean, the reception that we got in terms of the questionnaire we had and the people that talk, we got incredible questions. Like, now it's a pity because of the pandemic, but many people, they will approach me and ask me if they're going to Kyoto where they could see this kind of dance, where they could go to see the performance. So yeah, I think it was very successful.
Well, this was fantastic, Danny. Thank you for taking so much time with us. And we will put some links below to your work and to the documentary, which can be viewed. Right? We'll be able to link that. I think you had mentioned there's a documentary you wanted to link.
Yes, I think we for people that are interested to learn about the Kiyomai in our review is it's the documentary that I just mentioned that we project during the performance. And I will put a link of the website, the homepage we create for the performance in UK, so they can also download and read. It's in English, obviously, the program, so they can also learn about the Kiyomai no Rio.
Well, that's great. Yeah, we'll definitely add those links below, and we'll put the ways that you can keep up with Danny. I want to wish you the best of luck. I know you're not yet done with your work in Kyoto on this subject, so I hope it goes well. And I really want to thank you for all the time you spent with us, and I want to thank our listeners and viewers for tuning into the channel, and just remind them to subscribe. And you can click the bell to get notifications, and please share and like the video. And I hope you'll join us again, Danny. This was really amazing for me. I'm still thinking about that philosopher's quote and learning about the cherry blossoms. So I really appreciate your time.
I hope that it makes some sense what I said.
Well, it's a good beginning for sure. And I always think of the Basho quote, between our 2 lives, there is also the life of the cherry blossom. And now I will read that quote differently based on the what I learned in our conversation from that Japanese philosopher. So thank you again for your time. Good luck. And hopefully maybe we'll have you come back and join us about other aspects of your work and life in Kyoto. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.